All right. Good morning. Good evening. Good afternoon to everybody, anywhere you're watching. I don't know. You and I are in different time zones right now, right? We're not in the same time zones as
We're not
usual.
quite the same time zone, but we're closer. Sorry for the vacant look when I joined. I was just tweeting that we
Oh,
were
good.
going. So hopefully we'll get
I.
a few people online for that.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. And you know the nice thing about this is there's the long tail, right? It's what we do here is very important, and I want people. I want enough people to have a good conversation, but not so many as to drown it out. I want them to listen to the good conversation as opposed to arrest the good conversation. Oh, let's see here. I feel like my headsets are not doing the right thing here. Yeah, I'm
You
connected.
sound fine. You sound fine to me.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, good. Oh, that's what it was. I was hearing feedback in my ears. That was not great. Okay, so yes, you and I are in roughly the same time zone, which is to say, at the ass end of the planet. We are way, way on the other side of the time zone. Actually, you're a wee bit closer. How many time zones do you have before you on New Year's? Crossing the
Really, only New Zealand, I think, is the only
yeah
significant population that's before us, if I remember
Christmas
correctly.
Tree Island, that area. Is that
Yeah.
all the same thing? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I'm 1 hour after you in theory at the moment. So this is, even though we happen to both be in San Francisco just a few weeks ago, it's great that we're doing this, even if it is thousands of miles and yet still only one time zone away. Look, we've had you on the show before, and you are such a giving person that you've done it in support of other people 2 times now, right? You did it with our friend Heather Venkura, which such a great conversation. And then I got the Beatles back together. I got you and Jurgen to reconvene, and that was, that's probably. It's very disappointing to be I'm young and to have peaked as an interviewer already at that point is very sad. I will never have a better moment, I don't think. But nonetheless, I'm super happy you're here. I wanted to get you on the show just directly because I wanted to talk to you about just all the stuff that was as yet unsaid. You've always been there for other people, so I'm really grateful for you being here. And so evidently are some other people here. We've already got people in the chat saying hello. And let's see. And there's my co-host and friend Deshaun. How you doing, my friend? Yeah. Okay. So let's dive right into it because so last time we had you on the show, we was with Jurgen. Jurgen is your co-founder, number 2 person to ever have worked on Spring, as the lower is. And so we talked at great length about the origins of Spring. So can you, without let's not do the whole thing over again, but can you just briefly give us the why did you build Spring, and instead of, and what were you doing at the time? Because I think you were working in music, yeah, like.
Well, that was earlier. So my highest degree is actually a PhD in musicology, which is on piano music in Paris between 1830 and 1848. I also did.
Wait, there's a date range?
1830 to 1848. I saw you had at least one listener in Paris who I'm sure will get that. It's a distinct period in French history called the July Monarchy, when there was they had periodic revolutions throughout the 18th and 19th century. So this was bookended by 2 revolutions and is generally considered by historians to be a distinct period.
You are a PhD, and so your title properly is doctor. I don't think you've ever once uttered your own name and prefixed it with doctor. I've never heard you do it. You don't rub it in people's faces. I don't think. In fact, Dr. Pollock and Dr. Sire, they don't do that either. Nobody does. I just do it as an honorific, one well deserved and earned. But that's your PhD in music, right?
Correct. Yes. I did do computer science. So I did a undergraduate degree in computer science. And then I taught at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, which is part of Sydney University. I taught for probably about 3 years, a couple of years part-time, then 1 year full-time. And then in 1996, my contract wasn't renewed because it was a very dark period for young academics in Australia, where
Right.
you had low pay and you had no job security. People who were over 40 were usually pretty great. They had tenure, but everybody who was in their 20s was in early 30s was really getting exploited by the system and doing most of the work. So I decided at that point that I couldn't see how I could get a mortgage in Sydney if I remained as a music academic. I think I was far more concerned about the lack of security than the pay. I wasn't particularly greedy for more money, but I did actually want to be able to, be thoroughly convinced I could afford to live in a house. So that caused me to go into software. But having said that, look, I'm someone who, you know me, you've known me for years. I can't really live without writing code. So, during that period when I was teaching the piano and teaching music history, I was also writing code. I was writing Windows shareware in C and C++ using the Windows API. I wrote a couple of things that were modestly successful. One was called Greenprint, which back in those days, there was no Windows printer driver. There were no Windows printer drivers that could do the things that npage does on Unix. And I wanted my code listings to, not destroy the planet. So I wrote a utility that did that. And to my surprise, people sent me checks. And I was quite surprised. I made precisely zero out of this because the checks were like physical checks for about 1995 for $20. And the cost of banking them in Australia was such that essentially it was a wash. So it was extremely nice of the people to send me checks, but I actually derived no income out of it whatsoever.
So you were part of the shareware scene, which I don't know if the young people remember, but it used to be that people would give out discs at swap meets or computer weekend meetups, and what's the word I'm looking for? Like an expo. Like every weekend, I remember going to universities, and they'd have vendors with tables out and a stack of floppies. This is before the internet was prevalent.
The big numbers came from magazines. So I think there was a magazine in Japan that had my program on the DVD or CD. It was probably a CD back then. And there were a couple in the States. And that when that would happen, you'd get quite a number of checks coming in.
I didn't know you did C++. That's amazing. By the way, what you just described is what is old is new. Like the instability in the market, the hesitation for people to invest wholly into the market at the moment for fear of not being able to afford a job, and not the software market. I'm just saying all markets. It sounds like you were going through the same travails in the 90s as a lot of young people are going through today, which I think is cyclical. Is there a connection between art, music, and engineering? Because I know a few people that are gifted classical art and humanities people that have done amazing things and do amazing things with engineering. Right? Have you seen any connection there? Or is that just anecdotal in my part?
To be honest, I'm not sure. I do know quite a number of people in software who are very good musicians. I think one person from the music world who's actually a good software developer. So that I think people generally, and actually she now is a software developer. But I mean, she also did a honors degree in music. I think people tend to go down the software path probably because of financial security. But in first year at Sydney University, I think there were 1,400 people in Mathematics 1 and probably 150 in Music 1. And there were 2 other people, and only one other person continued besides me continued with math after first year, who was also in music.
Oh wow. Okay. So maybe in that, I guess, viewed from that perspective, maybe they're exclusive, not there's no union.
Well, look, I mean, I do know people who are good musicians. So, for example, well, in the broader software industry, Peter Fenton, the VC at Benchmark, who was the first investor in SpringSource. Peter's a very good cellist. You probably know Alexander Heifetz.
No.
He's been a member of the Spring community for years. He actually was. I guess we just missed each other, but I actually caught up with him in Vegas at Spring One.
Oh,
Alex grew up, now lives in New York, but he grew up in the Soviet Union and left when he was in his late teens. He was a very serious
we did talk about him.
Yeah. So, and I mean, he's a great clarinetist. So, you know, he's probably one of the closest people I know who's really, you know, at a very high level in both software and music.
Interesting. I just anecdotally, I know a lot of people that got into Softtore because they wanted to see pixels dance. And there's something artistic about it. There's something about that visual stimulation that then hopefully translates into, I mean, how many people have gotten to Softtore writing enterprise backends now because they wanted to build their own game at some point, you know, the like. So it's interesting to me that your first foray into this was also sort of massaging text and output in a printer.
Yeah, it was a fun exercise learning the Windows API. And then so I think that one was written, that was actually, I think it was C++, but it was using the Windows API.
Win32.
Yeah. No, I supported both Win16 and Win32. There were a lot of hash,
macros.
Yeah.
Yep,
that was, and it did actually work on both. And then a little later, I wrote for a friend of mine who was doing some research in music. I wrote her an analysis tool, and that was modern technology. That was C++ with MFC. And that was just commercially licensed. I gave it to my friend Sarah, but I actually sold that to a few universities. So
Microsoft Foundation classes for those. That's the precursor to, I guess, what it would have been .NET or whatever. Okay, so very cool. That's amazing. Like you're actually, and I've seen you play. You've you know, I've heard stories, but I've also seen you play. You're obviously very gifted, and you still keep it up, right? I mean, yeah, I think you told me once that when you first got $1 or $2, you went out and bought a really nice piano.
I did, yeah, and I actually did. That was probably the most recent point in my life where I've gone, say, for over a year, like practicing more than an hour a day. Sadly, I don't seem to find that time now. But that was really helpful because I bought myself a baby grand, which I upgraded post-acquisition. But the little baby grand I bought first was actually pretty decent. So I got into practicing. And then, of course, in 2009, we got into the acquisition discussions with VMware. And I would be on the phone, I would say, probably 7+ hours a day, with obviously some gaps. And if I was at home, which I was for quite a lot of that because it was actually better than being in the office because I obviously didn't want to be overheard, I would often jump on the piano between calls, and it would really, really help. So, by the way, for anyone listening, if you find yourself in that situation, I strongly recommend the Brahms G minor Rhapsody. I think it's Opus 79, number 1. But anyway, Brahms G minor Rhapsody, I found that was really pleasing.
Meditative?
No, it is not meditative. Well, part of it is, but it's kind of, I would say, more tempestuous. Yeah, there are calm bits. But,
yeah. Something in which to express the turmoil, huh?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so that does bring us. I don't know. That feels. I think we've elided over a few things there, but so basically, you were in the 90s. You were working. You had done consulting. You right. You got into the industry. You were doing C++. That's not fun. that's not a great way to spend a Saturday evening, I don't think, even in the 90s. So then why Java? Where where did these things transform?
Okay, C++, yeah, it was interesting. And to be honest, I think we started, we did a software engineering module where we could use C++ in third year. And I don't think the academics knew anything about C++. I certainly didn't. So my early C++ wasn't very good. I guess by the time Java came around, I had actually kind of managed to figure out a bit about object-oriented programming. Yeah. But the reason that I switched to Java is actually a very deliberate career choice. At this point in time, I knew I was a good programmer. I'd written shareware. And I had absolutely no commercial experience. So I wasn't really very competitive in the job market. In fact, I remember going to a recruiter in Sydney, probably this would be about 1994, and he basically thought I was unemployable. He memorably told me that I was sitting at the bottom of the mango tree looking up at the fruit. I'm not sure what that meant, but apparently it was meant to put me in my place. So, yeah, I don't know, Andrew Pettigrew, if you're still out there, I think I probably got to the fruit.
Maybe. Actually, maybe you have even bigger things yet. I don't know. That's certainly possible.
I definitely had at least some of the fruit.
Right. Yeah, it's delicious. I've heard.
So, I really wasn't very competitive at all in the job market. And I decided I did actually manage to get myself a job in C++ in the UK when we moved to the UK. In retrospect, I realized it took me weeks to get an interview. And then I did quite well in the interview. I later discovered I was really lucky because the project manager who was the hiring manager was off sick that day. And he would have just thought my resume was not compelling and probably wouldn't have given me, but they had agreed to interview me, but I don't think he would have been very interested. Whereas because he was sick, they had two senior architects from a completely different team interview me. And that was great. We talked about double diamond problems and they were satisfied that I did understand C++. But I think, to be honest, I was lucky. So then after probably a couple of months of that job, I'm writing actually, I think, something to parse or to generate PDF files in C++. Somebody higher up the management chain had played a round of golf with somebody from Microsoft. So, that happened later. So they switched. They decided to switch to Java, and then later they decided to switch to Microsoft. But okay, the first one they decided to switch to Java. And quite a lot of the people who were doing C++ left. I actually, to be honest, at this point, barely thought Java was a real language. I actually knew some Java. But I saw a career opportunity because I could go from being extremely uncompetitive in the world of C++ because I had no experience to having more experience than virtually anyone else in Java. So I was like, that is why I jumped on Java. And by the way, I think this is great career advice for younger people. Very often it is a good idea to choose something that's new because you are going to struggle to compete with the older technologies out there. So for example, in the Spring world, if you can, make yourself an expert on Spring AI because then you'll know as much about Spring AI as other people. Whereas, some of the more established things, you're going to be competing with people who've got a lot of experience. So, I guess
a big fish in a small pool.
Then I had a bit of good luck in that this was the day of the waterfall, essentially. So I was a contractor and there was a member of permanent staff who was creating the object model. And we were not allowed to write code until this object model was produced. So I'm going to work every day, being quite well paid, and obviously feel kind of guilty about this, and it's not my fault. I'm working in a team of people, none of whom is able to do anything because we're not allowed to. So that was the time when I thought, okay, what am I going to do? Java 1.1 had just come out. So I really, really got into Java at that point. So yeah, thank you for those few weeks of literally having nothing to do at work. I was able to study Java.
And when you first got into Java, I mean, the thing I had trouble with C++ was you're hampered in your first steps with that language by the sort of extrinsic complexity of memory management and platform specific stuff, and also like give me a string, I mean, just some basic stuff that wasn't consistent, so there's all these things I didn't realize were hampering my ability to fully appreciate and take, because I wasn't fluent in the language, and you have to get fluent in all that stuff before you can feel safe caring about encapsulation and object orientation and object design, and so I actually learning Java made me a better C++ engineer because I was free from so much of those foot gun things,
Well, I never really liked C++ as a language. I liked the promise of object orientation, but it just never felt quite right to me. I actually really liked C. I thought C was a really good language for what it does. Whereas C++ was kind of a little bit of a mess. But the biggest practical problem, to be honest, back then was the standard libraries and compilers were so buggy. There wasn't even really a standard library that amounted to very much in the 90s. And there were just so many bugs in pretty much every compiler that it was a very frustrating experience. I mean, obviously, I'm way out of touch with C++. I'm sure it's radically different and better now. But back in the 90s, it was something that in many cases you just had to go through a lot of pain to make anything work.
Yeah, exactly. And if I pity those for whom that was their first language, because you just don't know what you're missing. Back then, again, that C++ got auto, they got var before we did in Java. I mean, that language has come a long way, of course, to your point. Anyway, so you're doing Java and you're out there doing consulting. As you said, I've heard you describe it many times as you're making money. You're doing good. It's the .com boom. Things are not nearly so, they would get worse, but at the time it sounds like for you and others it was a pretty good time to be a Java engineer.
Well, my experience of the .com boom was a bit different to people in the States because I was just paid by the hour. I didn't ever get any equity in anything, so I avoided both the potential growth and also the potential the actual crash. But look, I was really happy with what I was doing. One of the jobs I had was ft.com. I substantially re-architected
Financial Times.
ft.com. And that was one of the two things that led to Spring. So essentially, I created an in-house framework that was essentially an MVC framework, which had the very first take on dependency injection that led to Spring. And that was probably in production from late 99, 2000.
So contemporaneous, or even just a little bit before Struts, for example.
It was when I had to leave that job. Yes, unfortunately, I loved that job, but had to leave because my mother became sick in Australia and I had to move back to take care of that. I thought, okay, there's this open source thing, Log4j and Struts was basically it. Open source at that point was not really a big thing. And I thought, well, this sounds great. I don't want people having to maintain the framework I built. Let's align with open source. And I looked at the Struts one code base and was horrified. So, for example, their controller servlet was a singleton at that point in time. We already had one app that had 12 controller servlets in it. It was hilariously bad. So I don't know how long the framework that I built endured. I imagine they probably switched to Spring at some point. But I was deeply shocked that Struts was not good.
Missed opportunity.
And then, so that experience at ft.com was important, and I think I'd learned a lot by, amongst other things, building a very successful framework based on servlets, and
Yeah.
also attempting, because it was obviously the right thing to do, to migrate some of our stuff to use EJB, and discovering that this was not a good thing. So, I mean, in retrospect, I feel embarrassed that I even felt that I should do it, because it was actually running in JRun. We were at this time, FT.com was essentially giving away the crown jewels for free. The FT Global Archive was astonishing. Pretty much anything you wanted from any newspaper in the world, you could go and search for free, and it cost a fortune to run. So they eventually changed the model. But, you know, we had built a complex site that I think at the time was like number 30 in the world for traffic. It was extremely high. And it was running just fine with the servlet-based framework running on JRun. And my attempts to, you know, put EJBs in, because obviously that would make it even more scalable.
Surely.
We're not really very successful. I mean, eventually we discovered that WebLogic, albeit extremely expensive, was a very good product. I mean, WebLogic was always a great product. But like, we evaluated all the leading other candidates at the time, and they varied. Like, I couldn't actually get Sun's latest version of whatever iteration it was of their app server. I'd never succeeded in getting it to run.
Yeah.
IBM at the time said no, I could not download WebSphere, but they'd have to send someone to install WebSphere. And I was like, you know, if it's that hard, the answer's no. So I got the bullet there. JBoss did not exist, obviously, and there were various other things like Bluestone and Persistence Power Tier, all of which were basically usable.
Yeah.
So okay, that's part of that experience led to Spring. The other thing is I had to leave that job, which I loved, went back to Australia, decided to write a book. And book became, probably got a copy of that. Got a copy of that book here.
There you go. Expert One-on-One, J2E Design and Development.
Really rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? The title was not my choice. The title was a series that Rox Press had started. So the process, so at this point, I'm doing a bit of consulting work remotely, but, you know, I have quite a lot of time. And it was like writing, I felt a bit like a priest writing a book about their faith, and discovering during the course of writing the book that they don't actually believe. So I am so sorry that the laptop I wrote that book on was stolen. And there was the original draft for chapter 1, which basically was around the lines of, you know, EJB, you know, you've got to put in the effort, and EJB is the thing. So by the time I'd finished writing the book, I didn't believe that anymore. So it was actually a pretty stressful process. I did not set out with the idea of writing a controversial book. I set out with the idea of writing a book basically telling you that J2EE as it stood was great, and this is how you should become successful. Hi, Richard.
We've got lots of people are happy to see you here on the old internet. So that book, by the way, that picture, somebody just said, I love the picture on the, Richard said, I love the picture on the cover. That's the picture that became the basis for the bobblehead.
It is, yes. That picture was taken, I was sitting on my dining table in London. We had a fairly small lounge dining room, and the professional photographer set so much equipment up in that room that there was barely any room for anything, and it was his idea that I should do that. So
such a great
it's not a characteristic pose today.
No, I've never seen you strike this pose ever since. Okay, so that's very kind of you, Richard. Thank you for that. Likewise. Okay, so you're out there trying to live the dream, only to have it sort of smashed, right? And you've decided that EJB in particular wasn't all it was cracked up to be, so having written that book, the book as I read it was a set of prescriptions for an alternative, not all of which implied it wasn't. You were certainly going against EJB, but a lot of it was sort of just patterns on existing stuff that worked. Like you didn't forsake JDBC, for example,
no.
or the servlet stack.
So I guess the key arguments in the first book were the entity beans were just a terrible idea. I mean, we're not talking about JPA. We're talking about the previous,
1.0 incarnation.
And 2.0, which was utterly terrible. So basically, don't go near entity beans. Think about your obsession with abstraction from the database. Like I worked in various places or consulted to them where they paid a fortune for Oracle and then proceeded not to use any of the features they'd paid for. So it was like a pragmatic argument that, data tends to stick where it lands. Back in this era, Java developers were obsessed with database portability. You couldn't use anything that was specific to your database.
Which blows my mind because of all the things. I mean, who changes databases that often? Your Java framework will change more often than that.
The vision was that the Java framework would never change because EJB would rule the earth. You would probably do EJB entity beans with CMP, container managed persistence. Right. And your database would be ephemeral. You were going to regularly switch between databases, and you could do that without changing your Java code. I mean, it made absolutely no sense. So that was, I think, one of the controversial things. Some of the other controversial things in that book was that in most cases, I don't believe in checked exceptions. And I literally got hate mail about that. And somebody on the server side actually said that I was trying to do this to destroy the US economy because I was a foreigner and I was intent on, causing exceptions to destroy the US economy.
So, I mean, you're not alone. I mean, I think Bruce Eckel didn't love checked exceptions. I mean, there's a lot of people who...
I think Bruce was the first person I'd ever seen. I think he came out with that slightly before I did. Yeah. He was the first person I'd ever seen who basically questioned that because the orthodoxy at that time was very, very strong. And I mean, obviously the whole design of Spring JDBC and JDBC template goes back to the 30,000 lines of code that I wrote with the book. And that, of course, you have the hierarchy of meaningful exceptions that are actually unchecked. And I mean, one of the things that hardened myself in that position is at the time I was doing some consulting across Pearson Group, which owned FT.com. So they would get me to look at other code bases. And so I had access to a lot of their code. So I had a look at a lot of their code and I found hundreds, if not thousands of catch blocks, not a single one of which added any value. And the only question when you saw a catch block was, well, where's the first error that could cause a connection leak? And secondly, are we losing the stack trace? And normally we lost the stack trace. So that, and again, this was not something I was eager to think. I was seriously agonizing. I mean, well, agonizing is a slightly grand term for a technical discussion, but I was really bothered that how is it that everyone has this religion and I cannot share it?
The emperor has no clothes.
Yeah.
And by the way, you were validated. I mean, C#. I don't think they sort of punt on that as well. I mean,
yeah, I think they did. To be honest, I haven't kept up. But I mean, if you Kotlin, I think the checked exceptions by and large were a failed experiment. And I think they're absolutely a failed experiment where it comes to infrastructure. My iconoclasm with checked exceptions knows no limits. I actually don't mind them for control flow, which is how they're hardly ever used in Java. I think that actually kind of does make sense as like an alternate return.
You mean like
path.
a go-to?
Well, it's not a go-to because you're actually passing context in the exception.
Yeah.
I mean, it is. Yeah, I find that. So, for example, I think it makes no sense to throw an exception if, say, you're doing a bank transaction and there's a database error. You're not really going to catch that in the next level up. Whereas if, on the other hand, you have a withdraw method and there's insufficient funds exception could be checked because the caller needs to know you tried to call something and it didn't work. That, to be honest, I think it's a marginal thing, and you've obviously got other things like you've got more functional approaches. You can do that, like either and those kind of things.
Yeah.
But I think that is much more defensible in using them for infrastructure.
So when you say control flow, you mean I'm trying to convey semantics of this problem space, as opposed to I'm trying to use it to handle errors that I have no ability to recover from anyway.
Yes, domain-specific, alternate return path. So domain-specific, meaningful exceptions that you actually literally are. What is a checked exception says you call this, you have to handle it. Or cheat, and normally people cheat, but where literally, I think it has, for me, to be useful, a checked exception has to meet two criteria. One is that the caller can handle it. The direct caller can and should handle it. And the other one, I think, is that it can pass up meaningful information. Right, that the exception is potentially actually does explain to you, contextual information that's helpful.
Yeah,
but that of course applies to any exception. The latter one applies to any exception.
Right. Okay, so wow, that was a really great discussion about checked exceptions. I don't know how we got so far afield in that particular topic, but I love that. That's really great insight. And people forget all the template objects in Spring were designed with they throw an exception. They throw it for you so that you can have the callback interfaces all throw exceptions, so you can write code unburdened by having to manage all that. If you want, you can let it bubble up to the framework, which is great.
Well, of course but they're also meaningful. Like with JDBC, you got a SQL exception that wasn't tremendously meaningful, whereas in the Spring JDBC and other like Spring abstractions, you get a really nice mapping onto what kind of exception it is. So, for example, with Oracle, very early in the Spring days, Thomas Risberg and I had a long chat as we walked through Greenwich Park in London, and decided that we could actually do the mapping from the Oracle exception codes. So Thomas did that, and now it's a lot better than SQL exception was, because it actually gives you its best shot at what meaningful problem occurred.
And you get the same thing with what I thought. By the way, Thomas, still on the Spring team, just one of the most lovely people. You get that now we got it back then with JDO, RIP, rest in peace.
Yeah.
You got it with JPA. You get it with Apache OJB, which also RIP. All these. Do you remember OJB?
I have not. I remember the acronym. I never used it.
Yeah, it was better than NTD Beans and EJBs 1 to 2. Certainly. Spring had support for it. I mean, it's long since been discontinued,
that must have been Jürgen. I didn't. I don't believe I was involved in that.
Oh yeah. Well, either way, it was all these great technologies. Same hierarchy. You get these very consistent data access exception, sort of specific. It's really, really brilliant. And it's just one of these small things that you don't even really know is there, but it's just so consistent and it's so well designed. And that was 20 plus years ago.
And you're still seeing those ideas pop up. So, for example, in Spring AI, you've got whether it's transient, right? Like the exceptions, you can respond to differently. Yeah,
I love that. Okay, so that was
that's if I can say one more thing about checked exceptions.
Anything.
Exception hierarchies are more useful for unchecked exceptions, because you can literally catch the ones you can handle. Whereas with checked exceptions, you're going to be forced to handle the base class. So you're going to be, even if you, let's suppose you can handle one leaf class, but you can't handle the general case. Well, you are going to be forced essentially to write some code that adds no value.
And then
it'll be
we
confusing.
didn't have smart.
Yeah.
And we didn't have smart switch expressions and pattern matching back then. So you'd have to, if this exception is this, then
yes,
you'd have to sift through or handle a bunch of them, which is ugly.
Yeah. Exactly.
So okay, so Spring clearly got a lot of stuff just more than right. I mean, it was just shockingly good early on. That was in part because of this book. But then I think your biggest success, amazing engineer though you are, was just attracting the right kind of people. This is what makes a leader as opposed to an engineer. And we've talked about Jürgen, and we just mentioned Thomas. And I mean, anything you want to add to that?
There are some really, well, I mean, obviously Jürgen is totally exceptional. I mean, even in a team that's an outstanding.
Not checked though.
Jürgen's pretty special. Yes.
Yeah.
So I think, look, some of the things that were really important about the formation of the Spring team, I don't think I realized until much later how unusual they were. One was the team was aligned from the get-go. So the book, amongst other things, not only laid out the general philosophy around J2EE, but also actually has a pretty long chapter on coding style. So people were agreed on that. So, you know, I know lots of people don't like my naming conventions. People were agreed on that. And by the way, it makes AIs work really well with Spring because it's just so consistent.
That's a great,
very, very helpful. But, you know, there were a range of things where people knew what they were signing up to and basically shared this view. So there was kind of a selection process. Secondly, with Spring, and this is why Spring succeeded where J2EE failed, Spring was built by people who came out of the practitioner space. So the people who built Spring, including myself, had been consultants, had worked in banks or worked in the places where people use the software. Whereas people in Santa Clara, or Sun Office Menlo Park, wasn't it? Didn't really understand the end user of their technology at all. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, in my interactions with Sun Java folk in the 2000s, I was just astonished at how little they knew about the people in London, New York, all the other places who are actually building real systems using J2EE. So I think that coming out of practitioner space was really, really important. Thirdly, I think that everyone in the Spring team modeled good behavior. We never had any tolerance for, rude behavior in forums. And I think that not only attracted the right kind of people, but also helped grow a healthy community. So, I think one of the great things about the Spring team is they've always actually exhibited good values as well as good software skills. And I think that's really important. That, for example, when Spring at various times adopted ideas from other projects, we always acknowledged it. Take, for example, the annotation injection model. That was Bob Lee's. Sadly, the late Bob Lee. That was Bob Lee's idea. And it was a good idea. So, we acknowledged that. And we never did the kind of thing that, for example, various other projects took features from Spring while simultaneously not acknowledging it and attacking Spring. We never did that. We would recognize that good ideas also occurred outside the Spring team, and it was our job to make Spring better, whether they were with our ideas or other people's ideas.
And I think that's, the initial offering of the things that came in Spring 1.0, for example. If you looked at that and said, each module here was very, very intentional, they you didn't replace JDBC, you and made it cleaner and easier. And if you have a strong enough opinion that it felt like it was worth replacing it, it was very intentional. And I you're right. Spring was not a replacement for things; it was a integration of 80% and then a replacement for 20 or something like that.
Well, fortunately, there was a lot of good stuff underneath. I mean, although the edifice of J2EE ultimately included lots of things that were best avoided, the fundamental basis was pretty solid. And I mean, like Java and the JVM is a wonderful piece of software, and it was even back in the early 2000s. So
especially
there was a whole lot of good stuff that Spring. So essentially, I think what we did, like, there was nothing wrong with JDBC. What we did was, there was nothing wrong with JDBC if you didn't use it directly. There was nothing wrong with JDBC as a foundational layer. So, I think with Spring, what to some degree we were able to do was release the goodness that, had been created in that ecosystem.
And also pull these things together. I wanted to get back. I just had a thought. You mentioned the good behavior, and that is so manifest. I don't want to pull this conversation too far into that, but I do want to point. I had a moment where I said something snarky, let's say. Not great, not my finest moment in my early career with the Spring team on the Twitter, the Bird site, whatever it's called these days, and Arjen Poutsma, the amazing, the legendary, the oracle, of the Netherlands. He took me to task. He sent an email to the Spring team saying, "This is not who we are. Do better." And I'll never forget. And he was right. He's always right. I mean, he's never wrong, right? I love that guy so much. And I just remember thinking, gosh, who am I to, the reason I was so grateful to be there was because I was dealing with all these amazing people that were so nice to me. Why would I change that? Why would I spoil the broth, And I'll never forget that. That was 14 years ago, a long time ago. And I appreciate it.
You can have strong opinions and yet, act respectfully. So, for example, Bob Lee, who tragically was murdered last year, Bob and I were really quite good friends, and we agreed about something in Java. We disagreed about other things, but we always respected each other and appreciated that we were coming from a position of honesty. And I think that kind of intellectual honesty and respect has been core to the team, and I think that has helped the team not only be a very stable team, but be a team that I think has fostered a good community.
Yes, 100%. You just mentioned the late and great Bob Lee again, and actually, I was thinking about that. You mentioned that Spring is it's informed by practitioners, and I agree, but also it was informed by high-minded practitioners, and there's a difference. And what I mean by that is, to read your first book was a lecture in the latest and greatest patterns. I mean, dependency injection, we didn't take that for granted. Aspect-oriented programming, we could not take that for granted. These are two things on which both you and Bob had competed, right? I mean, he had his own Aspect. Was it Aspect Works or?
No. Oh God, what was Bob's one? Aspect Works was Jonas, and then there was John. One of the Scandinavian guys who was at ThoughtWorks. John Thiessen also had his own. So actually, no, on AOP, Bob and I really collaborated more than we competed. So we set up the AOP Alliance, which I think you've still got that jar on your class path somewhere.
It's inlined now, though.
Yeah. And so that API was probably Bob was the most influential. But I mean, it was pretty similar to things we each had in our own frameworks. Yeah. So that was really a collaborative exercise.
Oh sure, and even the JSR 330, which is ultimately around dependency injection. The fact that you both had opinions about this and were thinking about it, and I don't want to make this too much about the late and great Bob. What I'm trying to say is Spring was not just a practitioner's. It was a I think you drew a lot from what I would have called or termed academia, or from research, or from things that were not known commodities at the time, and pulled them in and made them useful, production worthy.
Well, I think there were a couple of things that really bothered me. One was that we were just at that point in time, we had been educated on the value of unit testing and TDD. And you couldn't unit test J2EE applications. So that was really troubling to me. Another thing was that design patterns, Gang of 4 design patterns, really weren't terribly relevant to J2EE applications, because you had to jump through so many hoops that, like, the code that you wrote didn't really look much like good object-oriented code. In fact, many years later, Eric Evans, the author of Domain-Driven Design, who's a very wise man, by the way. I strongly recommend people to read Eric's book, and also, anything Eric says is definitely worth deep contemplation. So Eric told me years later that he almost quit software because at the time he was largely working in Java, and it was just so depressing, the kind of things people were writing in that early J2EE era.
Oh dear, what a loss that would have been. Was this before Domain-Driven Design in 2004?
It would have been probably about the same time, maybe slightly later.
Oh gosh, can you imagine if he didn't write that book? The world would be worse for it, for sure. Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit here, because I think the lore around Spring it deserves as much coverage as possible. But fast forwarding here, 2009, you've become part of the old VMware family, and then I think this is kind of interesting. This is sort of where I was actively in collaboration, as an outsider, and then eventually as an employee with the Spring team. And I just kind of look at those halcyon years with some affection, because I just think it was a very new, interesting page in the chapter of SpringSource, and you're wearing the SpringSource shirt.
I am, yes.
That was from
post VMware. One of the VMware. Yep, it says a division of VMware.
Right, and I have that same one. That's Adam Fitzgerald, I think, was the one who outfitted us with those. Yeah. And so I don't know. That was 2000. I mean, when did it sell? 2009, I think, was the deal, right?
September. It closed September 2009. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, at that point, my job was largely a business job. So probably I was no longer daily cutting code in Spring after about 2006. I certainly still had an influence. So every so often I'd come up with crazy stuff that it might work or might not work. One of the most recent, the latest crazy things I did was Java configuration, which did prove to be very, very important after Cost and Lau finally made it work properly. But yeah, I was principally by that point business job, and I spent probably more time with the marketing and sales executives than I did anywhere near code. Yeah,
and I remember that because you did, like you said, you did put your hand on the scale every now and then as concerns software and code and what all. But I just remember you being, this very, very busy frontman for a amazing group of people that needed to be not protected, but be put in the best light. They needed somebody to be out there and representing them. And every now and then you'd come back and do these amazing things. You mentioned Java config. 2011, you did Spring Data, right? The first bits.
Yeah, that was actually myself and Emil, the CEO of Neo.
Neo4j.
So, yeah, the first version of that.
And then you also did Spring Roo, I think was some.
Well, no, that was Ben. I was very supportive of that because I really felt that we needed to get a breakthrough in productivity. As it turned out, I mean, Roo had great ideas, but it wasn't, it turned out the correct way to do that was later what they achieved with Spring Boot, which was after I
Yeah.
left. But it was. I was very concerned that we needed something that like really delivered a productivity breakthrough. And Rue had great ideas.
I wrote a book. I'm a fan.
Yeah.
Okay, so all that to say, interesting time. Eventually, I think you had been working on this stuff for more than a decade straight without sleep or cessation. So 2012, and 2012 comes around, and I think you finally, all the places you will go, right? The last blog you wrote on the Spring blog.
Oh, that's right. Yes. Yeah.
Was that a Dr. Seuss reference?
Yes, I think it was.
Dr. Johnson referencing Dr. Seuss. Two of my favorite doctors. People don't understand why I mention you all the time. There's a reason. And then you, I don't know, you could have done anything. And what I always thought was kind of interesting was you dove headlong back into tech, and you sort of at this point you're now not just a engineer and not just a leader, but you're also acting as an entrepreneur and a venture capitalist. And so I think you had this really amazing portfolio, at the time. I don't know who else. You were involved in TypeSafe, which I thought was an amazing company.
I was involved in TypeSafe, which now, of course, is Lightband. Also, I invested in and was chair of Neo for a few years.
Neo4j, love them.
I love graph databases. It's something where, it's not that I try to promote graph databases because I'm a shareholder in Neo. I'm a shareholder in Neo because I believe graph databases are important.
Sure,
and I was the first outside investor in Elastic. Which was obviously a great story. Elastic was the initial CEO was Stephen Sherman, who was the ex-SpringSource executive. Obviously the software was created by Shai Badon, but Stephen ran the company for a number of years. Also Hazelcast, Apollo, GraphQL. So look, I really cool stuff. I really enjoy being a board member at an early stage. I think it's really interesting to just try to help teams and founders be more successful. So essentially, I think the role of a board member at an early stage is really to try to make sure that the founders are the best versions of themselves and are able to grow in the areas where they need to grow, hire people they need to complement them. And that has been profoundly satisfying to me. So for example, Emil at Neo was fairly young when I first invested. Now he's running a company with many hundreds of people, very significant revenue, and he's a great CEO. And I think it's just been a privilege to have played a little part in journeys like that, where someone was able to grow and become a very, very complete CEO.
And I would love to get him on the show. I haven't talked to him in
totally should get him on.
A couple of years.
Yeah.
He's brilliant as well. And actually, I just realized that portfolio of yours, a lot of that is, I guess, what we would have called at the time NoSQL, and that makes your having bootstrapped Spring data all the more interesting. You were clearly very much in that space, now that I think of it, in that headspace, if nothing else.
Well, I was. I guess one of the things that attracted me to Neo was I heard Emil give a talk I think it was in Aarhus in Yao, however you pronounce it.
Yao, that's the one.
Yao back then. So he was the first person from the NoSQL space that made sense to me. Because, for better or worse, I actually know a lot about relational databases. And so many of the things that you would hear attacking relational databases from people in the NoSQL space were just painfully ignorant. Whereas Emil obviously knew exactly what relational databases were good for. He recognized that relational databases are going to play an important role. They're not a bad technology that you need to remove. And
Right.
like he spoke eloquently about, this is where graph is the right representation. So I was, not only did I believe in graph databases as a model, I really was impressed by his vision of the whole landscape. And like, there's not any one size fits all solution. There are different types of data requirements.
He upended in the same way that you did. Actually, I if I can pay him a compliment, he upended the orthodoxy. He said, "Hey, relational databases aren't all that relational, right? They're not really good at that." Awkwardly, and it was a very simple, like, once you heard that, you have to hear what happens next, right? You can't just leave that sentence hanging in the air and then not finish the thought. And he did. It's profound to hear him lay out that case in the same way that you made the argument for the simplicity and utility of something like Spring compared to the technologies of the day. Yeah, that's amazing. You acted as a mentor. I guess that's what, like you said, you help people be the best versions of themselves. Did somebody help you? Was there
that's a really good point. I think probably the person who helped me most was Peter Fenton of Benchmark at the time. This was one of Peter's earlier investments, so he spent a lot of time with SpringSource, and I think he helped me a lot. Another person who really I think I learned a lot from was Neil Choksi, who'd probably, I don't know if you've ever met Neil.
Tasktop. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So Neil was originally, he was CEO of Solarmetric that sold a JDO solution, and they were acquired by BEA. I met him when he was at BEA. And I realized that he understood a lot of things that I didn't about how to build a software company. So I persuaded him to join in probably like 2005. And I learned a lot from Neil. And I guess, look, one of the things that I learned from him, one of the things I think that was inspiring is I remember when we were writing our first business plan, I remember thinking, wow, this guy views like writing a business plan in the same way as I might view writing a piece of code on Spring. It's like, he sees this as creating something of beauty. And it was really inspirational to me that, wow, this business stuff, you can take pride in like really valuing it. Because Nealon's a very smart guy. I mean, he's an MIT chemical engineer by training, who later did an MBA at Chicago. So, it was just really, it made me think differently about business. This guy is so smart, and like he really values this and sees it as an art, a bit of both art and science. So yeah, that made a big impression.
He was in the same class as the card counters, right? At MIT.
He was. He and Richard McKern, who was
another name,
our first salesperson that we hired into SpringSource. I think both of them, like Nealon put himself through business school on the back of that.
I think he's I don't bandy this term around lightly. I'm quick to compliment, but I think he's one of the few geniuses I've ever met, just because I've heard so many war stories about him, or stories of myth, and then you see him go off and he was at SpringSource, but then he went off, did Tasktop.
Yeah.
That was another really interesting enterprise. That was a Canadian outfit. They were trying to do task-oriented programming, right?
They eventually, it grew out of Mick Kirsten, the founder, who's also one of my best friends. Mick's PhD thesis led to Eclipse Mylan. Remember Mylan?
Yes,
the thing
I do.
The task switch. It's a very good idea.
Context.
So that's what the company was originally based around. They pivoted a couple of times, and eventually it became more about like managing development processes. Mick wrote a book that was very well received a few years ago. So they've had a couple of pivots, but yeah, they're doing really well. They're now part of PlanView.
Oh wow, okay. I didn't keep up, but we did work pretty hand in hand at one point because we had the Code to Cloud. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do remember that
effort. That was really cool. I thought I still think that would have been, that's the dream, right? Like from my IDE to production and then back again. Yep. Give me that, please. And nobody's delivered it, and I would love to see it.
Yep. Well, yeah.
It's, and then, so anyway, fast forward. You, I think also, you were in the Scala community. People still talk about your storied Scala Days 2012 keynote, or 2013 in New York.
2013.
Yeah, and in which you wrote poetry using compilable Scala 2 code, which was mind-bending. And then also that was where I think you and I both were taken aback by Shadaj Ladad, Ramnivas Ladad's prodigal son, and he was what, 12 or whatever. I still think about that.
Yeah,
ridiculous
13,
presentation.
I think. Yeah, I went along to his talk to support him because Ramnivas is a friend, and I was just blown away. It's like, this is possibly the best talk I've heard in the entire conference. And he's 13.
I think it was certainly the best in the conference. It might have been the best I saw that year. It was ridiculous. He was anyway. Okay. He's doing amazing things now too. I mean, Ramnivas surely is doing great things, but I'm saying Shadaj is doing great things. Yeah. So fast forward. So you're in this amazing space. You're dabbling with you're a leader, you're a venture capitalist, and you had been an entrepreneur, but to the extent that you were investing in other companies, I suppose you could say you're an entrepreneur. But what made you get back into helming another company with Atomist? Like, what?
Well, I think it was I mean, you played a role in that, actually. I guess I was really impressed when you showed me Spring Boot, and I started pondering the microservices era and what are the consequences of making it so easy to create microservices. So, with Atomist, we sold a couple of years ago to Docker, and amongst the
wonderful
technology coming out of Docker, you'll see Docker Scout. Docker Scout is basically part of Atomist. Vulnerability scanning. Atomist, I think, to be honest, was a little bit too early. I think there's a little bit more convergence now around the realization that we probably need to rethink CI/CD. And I think people are very wedded to their pipelines. And we had a very different way of thinking about it. We had a very event-driven approach. And unfortunately, that was somewhat difficult to evangelize, which limited. It meant we didn't achieve a Spring level of success. But that was an interesting journey. During that, I wrote code in both Scala and also eventually TypeScript. I wrote a lot of TypeScript, which I really like. TypeScript's definitely up there in my two favorite languages. So that was an interesting journey.
I remember, I mean, again, it sort of goes back to that. I want information from my IDE to production and then back again. I think Atomist was uniquely positioned there. But again, I think it was a little too early in the same way that maybe the Code to Cloud stuff was just a little too early.
It definitely was. I mean, I miss what Atomist offered in terms of essentially being able to react to events with rich context during your development and deployment process. Every time I look at, my existing workflows with Google, what's it called? The Google build thing, or even GitHub Actions, it's kind of, it's disappointing to me.
I'm sorry. I loved Atomist, and as a result of that acquisition, the first of two that I think were key, Docker is now a really great company for Java infrastructure, right? Java people.
Well, I think actually it was it did obviously bring some Java people in, like Christian,
Yeah,
and Jim Clark, who's a former Java person, but she largely prefers Clojure. But I
sure.
think actually the acquisition of Atomic Jar was really important, and the
Very
test
good too.
components people, and they're
Yeah.
big Spring fans. So I've had chats. I've even done some pairing with Sergey, who very
Yeah.
kindly helped me improve some of my test containers usage. Yeah, that has definitely been, I think, significant within Docker to have a group of people who come from that background and really appreciate Spring and what Java has to offer. Test
And
containers
the
is great,
developer
by
at
the way.
large.
Test
So
containers
good.
is like, I've always cared a lot about testing. As I said, one of the motivations for testing with Spring was being able to unit test your business logic. Then you also
Yeah.
do need integration testing. So the integration testing functionality that I first wrote actually when I was on a client site, because I realized that if I spent a couple of days writing the first take on this, it was going to improve their productivity so much that it was perfectly legitimate to bill them for that. So the ability to test against real databases and have transactions roll back, that was really important. But then test
Huge.
containers, that to me, test containers, finally that completes the trifecta of fixing testing, where you can spin up these containers. It's very impressive.
Yeah. We're big fans on the Spring team, obviously. And yeah, they both Atomist and Atomic Jar, for reasons related to the word atom. I don't know. Both of you landed at Docker, and it's just a really they've pivoted in a way to developer sort of tooling. I don't know how to, again, providing more of that ability to integrate containers into your workflow before production, right? It's not just
Yes.
about the production story and the orchestration in the production story. It's a really interesting company I watch all the time now. I'm a big fan. I don't know if they do the Docker Captain thing anymore, but I think today I wouldn't mind
I've not heard that for a while.
Yeah, I don't know, but I could see myself becoming one today, whereas I wouldn't have bothered or cared 5, 6, 7 years ago. So okay, Atomist, really cool company. I mean, super smart people working on cool stuff. Of course, you're gonna get great results. The acquisition was 2 years ago, and I think the company is, Docker has gotten. They had a bit of a rough patch, and now from all outward indicators, it's just gotten better and better since then.
Look, I think Docker went through a tough time, but I think the last few years, I think they're doing really well.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so you were using TypeScript, which we agree is a lovely language. I feel like if it was just the language and it was paired with an actual compiler, I would be very happy. But to the extent that it's just a transpiler for JavaScript, I've never slept easier because of my use of it. I use it, but only because I can pretend it's a compiler if I close my eyes a little bit and
I think it's immensely better than JavaScript. I mean, I certainly
for sure.
wouldn't consider writing a Node or React project without using TypeScript. There are things about TypeScript that I think are quite lovely that I miss. So for example, union types, also type algebra, like partials, all those kind of things I miss even in Kotlin. Yeah, I think TypeScript is a remarkable achievement. And I mean, Anders Hallsberg knows what he's doing. So,
and creator of C# and Borland Pascal.
Yeah.
Brilliant guy.
I think it's really impressive, and I think it's been really, really good for the Node and related ecosystems. What I would really like is TypeScript and Spring. But given that I can't have that, I can have Kotlin and Spring. And Kotlin obviously gives you excellent interop with Java, gives you all the Spring you want, and it's very natural. So, that is the stack. That is my stack of choice at preference, at present. In terms of what I've been using over the years, as you said, I did a lot of Scala, did a lot of TypeScript, mostly on the back end, but also some React. And I also did for my sins quite a bit of Python because I got interested in machine learning a few years ago, and like even before the LLM moment. And so, look, I think Python is getting a whole lot better. Like recent versions of Python with things like type hints are dramatically better than your mother or father's Python. But I'd still not, to be honest, it's not the language I like to work in. So yeah, I have only relatively recently switched back to writing backend services on the JVM, using Spring and Kotlin, and I have to say I am really, really happy. I like Kotlin a lot as a language, and like Spring just works. Yeah, and also libraries on the JVM tend to just work. It is a very robust and proven ecosystem. I mean, obviously, one of the most proven parts is Spring, and anything that Spring works. But there's also a lot of other great stuff on the JVM that is or should be the envy of other platforms.
I mean, yeah, the list goes on. I think about all the logging libraries that work. Our testing framework was the original one, on which everything else was basically based. It's the envy of other ecosystems for sure. Is it possible? Did you ever play with Spring for Python? Greg Turnquist's amazing project.
I did not. I
think you would have liked it. It was great. I quite liked it. It was it's a shame that wasn't Spring. Like you said, it inspired incredible change in the Java ecosystem, but also without Spring for Python. There's a Spring for Ceylon project called Primavera. I don't know if you remember Ceylon. Yep. There was a Spring. There was a Cold Fusion, like a Spring-like thing for Cold Fusion. Do you remember that language? There was
Spring.net, which is Matt Pollock's project.
Yeah. Like there was a lot of people loved and embraced the patterns and ideas and precepts of Spring.
There also are frameworks on other platforms. Like there's at least a couple for Node. I haven't used any of them, but I think there's a couple of pretty well-established frameworks now that have a lot of those core ideas.
I've heard people. I haven't tried it. I don't know. I haven't, but I've heard people talk about Laravel in the PHP space as being a sort of the closest thing they've got to a Spring. I don't know. I've only heard good things, which is frustrating because it's PHP and I can't do PHP. But okay. Anyway, so you get to this point now. You're doing machine learning and data engineering and AI engineering and all this good stuff. Yeah, Python is prolific. It is everywhere, and I'm sure as you discovered the problem that I can do Python. I've been doing Python since the 90s. I like it, but at the end of the day, I wouldn't trust a 100,000 line program in it because I couldn't trust.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't see it as a language for large scale software engineering. However, one thing I would say is that I truly do believe that every serious programmer needs to know Python and preferably be fluent in it. Because, with the rise of AI, there's so much happening in the Python world that it's important to be able to understand it. So, for example, for Java and other JVM developers, I think it's a no-brainer to use Spring AI. I mean, it's like you get all the goodness, you get portability between models, you get a nice mapping from, types to LLM return types to Java types, etc. So, that works just great. But the fact is you will develop a deeper understanding of the space of working with LLMs if you're able to read Python fluently. And, if you're able to look at things that are built on LangChain or Llama Index, you're going to get ideas. So, one takeaway I would strongly suggest is even if you're a Java or Kotlin developer, you really should. You should get fluent in Python because it's
not all that hard either.
Language. It's not really, no. Yeah.
Yeah. It's I think that's part of the appeal is how many days did it take you before you felt like you could write something interesting? I mean, I expect you would have measured it in days, not weeks or months, because it's such a. It's like Lisp. You just get it or you don't.
it gets easier to learn languages, right? Like the more languages you know, there's only so many ideas, and languages are just combine them in different ways, except for
Yeah.
Scala that combines every feature that anybody's ever thought of in any language. But with the other thing that is great about learning languages is that it extends how you think. So every
Paradigms.
time you learn a language, I'm a pretty serious chess player, and there's a great quote from the late great Victor Korchnoi, who was one of the best players never to become world champion. Victor Korchnoi said that it's important for chess players to learn new openings regularly, because every time you learn an opening, you learn something new about chess. And it's because, openings essentially take you into particular kinds of structures. So to really understand an opening, you're probably learning more about a kind of structure on the chessboard that you didn't really understand before. And I think it's the same with languages. If you go learn a language, you are often extending the way you think about software. Yep, there's Victor. He played and lost 2 world championship matches. The first one, 1978, extremely narrowly. So the other weird thing about Victor Korchnoi is he peaked in his, I think, late 40s, whereas chess players usually peak around 30. So,
wait, is there some sort of cognitive decline that happens, or I would have thought
chess players pretty much always peak around 30.
Like
in fact, possibly
gymnasts?
like, yeah, they're. I mean, for example, the oldest player, I believe, in the top 10, I think it's about number 10, is Anand, who is a former world champion, and he's probably like one of the top 3 players ever. But he's like 52, 53, I think, and he is way older than anybody else in the top 10. It's odd. I don't know whether it's cognitive peak or, look, maybe to some degree it's just the sheer amount of study and effort that needs to go into continuing to play at that level. And people can't or don't want to keep that up forever.
Rod, you should really should have had me sit down. I didn't get onto the show thinking I would have my dreams of being both a floor gymnast and a chess grandmaster dashed as a person who's just entered his 40s. But here we are. This has been quite distressing, actually.
Talking about age in chess, it's quite possible we'll have the youngest ever world champion in December, because I think the candidate's winner, Gukesh D, I think he will be 18 at the time of the match. So it's quite astonishing to have had only that number of years on the planet and to have learnt enough about chess to be close to the best in the world.
Wow. Oh, this has turned into a chess stream, and I'm here for this. This is great. Oh, that's so good. I wonder. I don't know how do I turn this back into a Kotlin thing?
Okay, there's one other thing I wanted to say about learning languages.
Yes, please.
So, learning languages has never been easier because LLMs are awesome for this particular purpose. So, how, for example, I learned Python was to partly by saying to ChatGPT, is there an equivalent of TypeScript type cards in Python? Yeah. So, I found that incredibly useful because there's usually, for any concept, I, understand it well in at least one language. So I will actually ask questions describing what I know about how this works in the language where I fully understand it. And that works great. So I've found that being really useful. And then the most recent language I've learned is Kotlin. I'm probably a couple of months in with Kotlin, and I'm really, really loving it.
I just have a bone to pick with you here, Doc. I tried to introduce you to Kotlin years ago, back when we were first looking at Spring Boot. I'm just a little verklempt that you didn't latch onto it. So
yes, maybe I should have. I guess at that point I was pretty invested in Scala.
I think
And I mean, there are a lot of things I like
Yeah.
about Scala, but I think Kotlin is an extremely effective tool,
Yeah.
and I think it really is, even compared to Java, 21 and 22. If you see a Kotlin application with Spring, you're really seeing the full potential of a good framework, right? Like a lot of the ceremony and duplication that we still have comes from Java, like constructors, lack of default methods,
Yeah.
really honestly ugly collection syntax, and those things are not Spring's fault. And
No.
so when you dispense with them using Kotlin, your applications look very nice and dead.
I think you and I and anybody who's done it for long enough take for granted some of the ceremony, and when you start going into Kotlin and using it in production, and you realize that the main method is not a method, it could be just a top level function, and it doesn't even have to have, it could just be fun main parenthesis parenthesis curly bracket curly bracket. I mean, it just feels, I mean, it's these little things, the little a death by a thousand cuts in Java,
Yeah. And obviously, Kotlin stands on the shoulders of giants. Like, I mean,
sure.
Scala actually originated some of those
things.
But yeah, I just find it to be a very, very practical language. I find it very readable. And one of the most surprising things to me is I've discovered there are actually some things I miss about Python. And Kotlin has all the good things. Like, I actually really like, I mean, if you use the default code formatting style for Kotlin, it's actually your code looks very like Python. And it turns out, I mean, I hate the fact that in Python you're forced, it's like COBOL, white space is significant. That annoys me. But I actually find it quite readable. And also, Python obviously has named method parameters. It has defaults for method parameters, those kind of things, which Kotlin also has, are really quite nice. But I mean, also with Kotlin, I love the interop with Java. Like with Scala, interop with Java was painful in two areas. One was that, for example, with collections, the using collections in Scala was beautiful, but getting them to and from Java kind of like basically, spoilt the beauty. It was like, splashing bitumen on the Mona Lisa. You've got this beautiful collection picture and suddenly, oh, yuck, that looks quite nasty. Whereas I don't really know how they've done it in Kotlin, but it's painless. But secondly, there was an explicit choice regarding interop in the Kotlin community. And it was basically ignore everything that's been achieved in Java. Because we know better. We are smarter people. We are functional people. We're Java people. Many of them are unwashed people who believe in object-oriented programming. And, these poor individuals deserve to be totally ignored. And unfortunately, I don't think that really works terribly well for most of the domains in which people want to use Scala. So... yeah, Kotlin just strikes me as more practical. The interop with Java is excellent. I mean, obviously the Spring team have put in effort, and also JetBrains have always been very, positive about Spring. So it's really nice when people collaborate.
And it's productive. I've told this story a million different times, but and by the way, I think you and I both have an undying appreciation for the Java team and all that. So I'm not trying to say this to the detriment of their efforts, but the Kotlin team, they're not bound by the sort of spec process and the same life cycle and all that stuff. So you can actually have an idea, have a conversation, and then see that realized in the language in real time. Not real time. I mean, in weeks or months, if it's trivial enough. It's really quite nice to see a language that is used by so many respond that quickly, is I guess what I'm trying to say. And I get why Java can't, and I appreciate them for that, but
and I think that is a very important point, right? Kotlin is able to do that because Java can't. So and I mean, look, in fairness, it is important to note that as I said, Python isn't your mother's Python. Well, Java isn't your mother's Java. So Java has improved a lot in recent releases. And I think anybody writing in Java, you want to be on the latest version you can. Because, there've also been massive performance improvements, things like virtual threads. So, the Java team, I think we're very fortunate on the JVM. We've got both Java as a language improving. I think the Java team are also very collaborative now, which was not always the case. Like back in the Sun era, they could care less about Spring or any other open source framework. They literally had zero interest. Whereas now, the Oracle team is actually reaching out.
Quite good.
Mark Reinhold, for example, emails Jürgen. There is real interest in communication, and I think that's fantastic. I think it works for the benefit of the entire community. Actually, I should do a shout out to George Saab, who's, I think, played a huge role in that as an executive at Oracle. And the Java community's just been really fortunate that George is extremely technical for a senior executive, and that he really, really loves and cares about Java.
Is he? If you had to choose a peer who kind of mirrors your posture in the Java team, would he be the closest as a senior executive who can write code or cares about code?
Yeah, I guess I don't know how much code he writes now. He certainly understands it deeply and cares about it. He's actually also has a humanities background. I believe he has a PhD in philosophy. And he got into Prolog and logic programming for years before he joined the JVM team. So.
Wow. Okay. And by the way, that stuff is there are type systems, there's theorem solvers, things like that are out there. I still think that's an interesting branch of language design that maybe we could pull some more of that. Scala has a little bit of, it doesn't really have that. It has, I think you could get there with some very, very abstracted code, but just the idea that I can write something that it compiles and is therefore correct, is.
I think logic programming is a really interesting idea. And I actually wonder whether in the very important cause of trying to factually base LLM outputs, logic programming could play a role. So there's been a few academic papers I've seen on it. I think that potentially could be beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. So you just mentioned LLMs, and I know this is your forte these days. You seem to be deep down the AI rabbit hole. Where do you sit on these things? What's the opportunity? What's the untapped potential? What's the thing that is not worth further investment in the things that most inspire you? And what are you working on? What's your what's on your whiteboard that you would love to see done?
There's quite a lot of questions in that. Okay, what are the things? Well, LLMs are obviously amazing, and they're obviously going to have an enormous impact. So this is very, very real, and it is going to affect everybody's job in future. So I think LLMs are really great for certain personal assistant style tasks out of the box. So I mentioned learning new programming languages. They're totally awesome for that. And, for a lot of the things that we ask an LLM, and we often get what appears to be a miraculously good result, they're not really that useful for most business applications yet. And obviously there are many other forms of AI technology that are incredibly useful and that are constantly behind the scenes in our lives every day. But LLMs are relatively difficult to incorporate into enterprise apps. And I find that utterly fascinating. I find that problem of taking this wonderful, almost to be honest, miraculous technology and making it useful to enhance business applications, I think that is the pressing problem of the moment. And when I look at what I believe to be the skill set and background of people who will do that, I actually think that JVM developers and the Spring community are going to play a really important role in that. Obviously, there is a ton of work, pioneering work that's been done in the Python community. As I said, I think you need to be able to read Python so you can learn from that, because there's a lot of good work. And there are frameworks like LangChain and Llama Index. However, I don't believe that it makes any sense whatsoever for someone who's working on a business application in Java to write any LLM-facing code in Python. Because for a start, your LLM isn't in Python. Your LLM is at another end of a really simple HTTP call, in reality. So it's not like, obviously it's not running your Python process. So I think when we look at these problems of how do we take LLMs and make them useful as part of business apps, I think it's the same kind of skill set that, we have brought to bear in building business apps over the decades. And I just find that a really, really interesting challenge. So challenges like, for example, making LLMs more predictable, making workflows more dependable on LLMs, and also safety and guarding against hallucinations. So grounding your LLM responses in facts that you have, for example, extracted from a vector database or possibly a knowledge graph. All of this requires a degree of orchestration that is part of your app. And that I personally find fascinating, and it's where I think we're going to see a lot of important work come out of people working on the JVM.
I couldn't agree more. I wonder, though, are there new applications that new paradigms, new ways of interacting with computers that are not yet being well served, but that are now available to us? And what I mean by that is we have these request response based services. We have microservices. We had mobile phone apps. I don't know. Is there another? Are we going to see this rush to build Alexas and home pods, voice based things? What's the new interaction model for this stuff? I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, what's the next frontier look like? What do we, or is it just more of the same, just better?
Well, I think it is going to change the way we interact with a lot of resources. So, for example, I think conversational interface is going to become more important, whether that's text or chat or voice. But I can envision that, for example, the future of browsing might be quite different. The future of browsing could be predominantly conversational, with as much UI as you need at any point in time. So, for example, you could say, can you book me a flight to Vegas? I had a dream last night, actually, where you and Mark and I were co-presenting in Vegas. And unfortunately, you were the only one who seemed at all interested in trying to book a flight. So it was the day of the flight, and we couldn't book, so we weren't going to be able to give this talk.
No.
But imagine, for example, if you started off by saying, I need to go to Vegas, and eventually get to the point where you're going to choose a seat. Well, obviously, you want a UI seat map for that, right? You don't want to say, I want to sit in 2F if it's free. What
about this? What about that?
Yeah, so I actually can envision a scenario where your browsing experience is just what interface elements are necessary right at that time, and a very dynamic kind of thing. If it's a UI developer, I'd probably try to develop that. But also I think it's going to really change the back end. So I imagine most of you listening are familiar with the primary ways of, grounding LLM responses, which are RAG, so retrieving data and putting it into the context, and also function calls or tools, where you say, for example, if you need to know the weather in San Francisco, or you need to know the weather anywhere, here's the function you can call to give you a response that will be timely and hopefully accurate. So I think function calling is going to be more and more important. And I suspect we're going to have a lot of little endpoints that are needed to enable LLMs to interact with the world. So I do think that we're quite likely to see an enormous growth in these kind of things that are exposed so LLMs could use them.
And you said it. We did, by the way, for people who don't know, we actually did give that talk in Vegas. That wasn't a dream. And in that talk, it happened.
Yeah.
But and one of the things I think you said in that talk was something to the effect of like, I mean, you've got all this great Spring code. It does business. It does your business. It does the things that your business does. It's got the business logic. Why not expose some of that through these tools and give them to the LLM? You know, that's the new touch point. To that end, you mentioned the conversational user interfaces. You talked about that. A UI, thinking about it, is a visualization or an approximation of the problem space that I'm trying to work with or work in. And so if I want to arrange seats, I show myself a picture of seats. If I want to choose seats, I show myself a picture of seats and I choose a seat. And if I want to enter data, then I show a text field and so on. And that's because I'm the problem space that I want is the solution. The thing I want is the solution, but all the computer has been able to give me is the individual tools that if I take them all together, give me the solution. And so I have to put the information in and then make sure that gets synchronized to this thing. And then with that two things in place, I can now do some analysis and get a result. And it's all very manual. And now we're getting to that fourth generational sort of proposition where I can just say, I want this result. And the AI can pull these things together and give me the result, as opposed to the individual stages that would get me there. And I do wonder about what you just said is pretty interesting. What have you seen the new Apple Intelligence stuff? And
I've not seen any of it live. I'm actually really quite interested in what they're doing because I think it's actually a bit on-device models. Because obviously Apple does care about privacy. And it's a good thing about being a hardware vendor. If you're a hardware vendor, you can actually take privacy seriously and not destroy your business. So they are, I think, clearly betting that they're going to be able to do as much on device as possible. And I would say, given the rate at which smaller models are improving, that's actually probably going to be a pretty sound bet. So that's really interesting. I probably have, I think, less interest than a lot of people in GPT-5 and GPT-6, in that I'm sure it will be impressive, but I'm not sure the future is really about God models. I think the future is potentially about orchestrating multiple models that might even be smaller and may well be local and private. Because there's important considerations there.
What are your what's your if you had to ask a question and you needed an AI to answer it, which one would you reach for right now?
Claude. So I've actually relatively recently started using Claude. So I still use, for my own purposes, if I use a commercial model via the API, I use OpenAI. Partly because I guess I'm just used to the kind of prompts that seem to work for what I'm doing. If I'm asking about code, I will definitely use Claude. I will sometimes get a second opinion from the other model. But I find Claude is very engaging in the way it kind of iterates in conversations around code. I've also started using Cursor, which is essentially a distribution of VS Code that integrates with LLMs. You can use a choice of LLMs. I think the default is Claude. And I've only been using it for React development. I am obviously pretty wedded to IntelliJ for and Copilot for JVM development. But it's quite impressive and fast to be able to say to it, I want a new component under whatever widget, and it should have a drop down that is backed by data that comes from this endpoint, and that will work.
That's amazing. So that's okay. Again, full circle here. It seems like you're really enjoying the opportunity to have something at development that you can then see as a through line to production.
Yeah, I do think that what is possible now with Copilot and also more ambitious things like Cursor, it seriously improves productivity. I find that I'm much more productive.
Now, but you are, as we've just spent some considerable time establishing, a gifted engineer, and so it's no doubt that it's not surprising that you know the space well enough to understand what success looks like. Would you suggest that LLMs could be similarly productive for somebody who's a wayward engineer and doesn't know what they don't know? How do you feel about that prospect?
That's a really good question. And I do think there is danger. So, like, I discard some responses. I find that you really need to read the code carefully because it may prove to have bugs in it that you didn't notice if you just trust it. I think, paradoxically, I think the returns in productivity improvement are significantly higher for senior engineers than junior engineers. And I think they probably also mean that you need fewer junior engineers, which obviously is a bit of a pipeline problem because where do we get senior engineers from? So I don't know how that works out. But look, honestly, I think we're going to be writing far, far less code by hand year over year. It's going to be very different. And, I think I am personally, well, I'm certainly not an AI doomer, nor am I one of these people who believe that AI is going to utter in boundless abundance. I think I'm somewhere in the middle. And my take is fundamentally that this is something that's happening. We're not going to stop it or slow it. I think it would be somewhere between pointless and foolish and dangerous to try to slow it. And I think, therefore, we have to figure out how to make the best use of it, how to make it safe, and also how every one of us can personally make ourselves more competitive at everything we do through augmenting ourselves with AI.
Yeah, yes, 100%. I think it redounds to the Spring developers' benefit that we have all of our business logic in Spring, and so the new user interface is that LLM. If you like you say, just expose your tools, expose your functions.
Well, that is really interesting when you think about, obviously one of the things that Spring represents is that kind of thinking which predated Spring, that, to be honest, J2EE reflected, which is that you have layers in your architecture, right? And your UI layer sits on top. I mean, that was fine. It was just the way they implemented it. So clearly with LLMs, we're looking at something that's probably less trusted than, say, a React app. And we don't trust our React apps that much. Like, we've learned that we don't let them send up SQL, right? We mediate their calls through an API layer. So a React app, I think, is somewhat more trustable than an LLM. Because for a start, your React app or any UI is inherently restricted by what you can click on, right, interact with. Right? There are certain paths that the developers have said you can use these paths through the app.
Constrain the problem space.
Whereas an LLM, if you just give it, even say you give it a bunch of REST endpoints, it could become quite creative and decide to call them in ways that could cause problems on your back end. So, I do think there's a very interesting question of what is that mediating layer. Obviously, as we know with RAG, it's probably a vector database, maybe also ideally a knowledge graph for the data side of the problem. But for the function and tool side of the problem, I think it has to be mediated through an API layer. REST is the obvious lowest common denominator. But I actually wonder if that is really sufficient, and I wonder if something like GraphQL might prove to be a better fit.
I think it would, because I quite like the richer semantics. I mean, REST has well-known semantics, but to the extent that it's just a CRUD, CRUD isn't. There's no depth of semantics to that,
Well, exactly, and also essentially your LLM is going to be creating mashups, right? If you're purely reliant on that. And imagine if you or I are trying to work out how to achieve something, and we've got all the REST endpoints. Well, we might create something that's a performance disaster. Whereas with GraphQL, you are really bound by the kind of things that the designers of that API thought were appropriate to mash up. So yeah, I would say that's I think it's probably a beneficial technology, GraphQL, for this generation problem.
Okay. I don't know. I feel like we've covered a little bit here. We've run the map today. Any as we kind of wind down here, any parting thoughts? Anything you want people to know about? And if not, are you on the internet? Do you want to be found? And if so, where can people find you?
Yeah, I am Springrod on the platform formerly known as Twitter. And I am actually engaging more than I used to. I've discovered that if I screen out absolutely everything that's not related to technology, I have good discussions. So I'm just ignoring all the straight out ugliness that you see on that platform. So yeah, definitely happy to engage with Twitter. And by the way, I should say I'm really grateful for recently, every so often I ask about a problem that I have or whatever, and I'm really grateful for people who jump in and help. So yeah, it does feel like it actually, in some ways, it's not a great place, but when it comes to the Spring and Kotlin communities, it seems to be actually a pretty positive place.
I will second that, only because it establishes something very important. I have no doubt that people help you because they're just eager to repay back some of your decades of contributions to their benefit. But people also help me, and that there's no reason for that. It's just that people are nice. So I want to second that, only to say that you're right. That we have a great community, and they've been really nice, even to people like me who don't necessarily deserve it. And yeah. And by the way, you have helped me, obviously, on more than a number of occasions. Anyway, moving on. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Josh. Thank you for everyone who persevered for the last 2 hours. I hope it was worth your time.
Amazing. Absolutely. Bye, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks, Doc.
Bye.